Welcome back to part 2 of our podcast series on the Italian resistance. If you haven't listened to part 1 yet, I suggest you go back and listen to that one first.
Alla mattina, appena alzata, oh bella ciao, bella ciao, bella ciao, ciao, ciao alla mattina.
Before we get started, just a quick reminder that our podcast is brought to you by our Patreon supporters. Our supporters fund our work and in return get exclusive early access to podcast episodes, ad-free episodes, bonus episodes, free and discounted merchandise and other content. For example, our Patreon supporters can listen to all the parts of this series now. Patreon supporters also have access to 3 bonus episodes for this series, covering post-war anti-fascism, as well as discussions about films and music of the Italian resistance. Join us or find out more on patreon.com/workingclasshistory, link in the show notes. We've also produced a range of merch commemorating the Italian resistance and our theme tune, Bella Ciao. And as a listener to the podcast, you get a 10% discount off that and other items in our online shop using the discount code WCHpodcast, link in the show notes. As a content note for our listeners, this episode contains some descriptions of war crimes.
Bella ciao, bella ciao, bella ciao, 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 seppellire lassù in montagna, sotto l'ombra di un bel fior, e le genti che passeranno.
Because of the armistice and the Nazi occupation that followed it, the Italian resistance is sometimes depicted as a purely national war between Italian citizens and their German occupiers. We go into more detail about what's missing from that narrative in part 3, like the 2 decades of Italian fascist dictatorship before the German occupation. But one thing that's often ignored about the resistance was how international it was.
Nel Valle Sabbia c'era un campo di prigione e c'erano slavi.
In Valle Sabbia there was a prison camp and there were Slavs, there were Americans, there were Germans, all captured by the Italian army. After the armistice, on September the 8th, they couldn't go home because there was the war, and so many Slavs stopped with the Perlasca Brigate. Nella 122esima Garibaldi Brigate there were 4 Russians. Because the Russians couldn't go back home, they came together. There was also Professor Paramendik, a Slav, who was part of the Perlasca Brigate. He did some heroic things and was injured. Anyway, after the liberation, he came to Vestone and he bought the house in the hamlet of Forno d'Ono, the house where he'd been hiding, and he made it into a museum of the resistance.
However, this forgetting of international partisans is not just an accident, but reflects how these partisans challenged the dominant story of a national war against foreign occupation. We spoke to Davide from Cronaca Ribelli, a people's history project in Italy that's similar to WCH, who explained this a little bit more.
They've been forgotten because they do not fit in this kind of narration. They do not. Because if you talk about the national war, and that's all, how can you explain that there were like 5,000 Soviet soldiers fighting with the resistance? How can you explain that? It's not that they didn't have any choice. They fought for the resistance. 1/10 of them, they died fighting the resistance war in Italy, thousands and thousands of kilometers away from their home. Probably, Soviets are the biggest one, and the biggest number. There were other nationalities who fought, next to Italian partisans. Of course, for obvious reason, Yugoslavia is another one. There were even, I'll even give you another perspective. There were even Italian who were deserters in Yugoslavia and started fighting with the Yugoslavian resistance. There were a lot of them who were captured in Yugoslavia, put back in concentration camp in Italy. They were freed and started fighting again, together with Italians. Their example is even more clear on how it was not only about the nation, because they could have reached Slovenia easily. I mean, if you were held in a camp in Veneto, it's like 4 days by walking and you're home. They just decided to stay there and to fight because they knew that defeating fascism and Nazism was something more. You had Czechoslovakian, a few hundreds, I think. Yugoslavian was, I think, less than Soviets, but still within a few thousands. They said there were more than 50 nationalities. It was not only about the soldiers. There were even British who took part in Italian resistance. Of course, most of them, they were like, or prisoners that were freed, or, pilots who were shot. They were lucky and were covered by partisans. It's worth to mention when we go back to Soviets, saying that all the nationality of Soviets, republics were represented, not only Russians, Ukrainians, Belarus, Estonians, and people from the Central Asian Republic. It's huge. Like they had their numbers. It's like whole 2 divisions of partisans. Even more. Their number was so high. Another example, which is worth mentioning, is Germans. We had Germans, Austrians, who fought alongside the Italians. Rudolf Jacobs, someone we mentioned in our book. Rudolf Jacobs was a partisan in Liguria again. That one day just say, no, I can't go on with that. So, he could have just stayed in the Wehrmacht and keep fighting this war, or he decided to, switch side and become an Italian partisan next to the Italian resistance. And he died in this fight. He died fighting Germans. We had people from all in the British Empire. Indians, South African, Irish volunteers. Another one which is worth mentioning, it's good, I was forgetting about that. It's black partisans. The most known one is Giorgio Marincola. He was half Italian, half Somali, who just fought, and he died, I think, even after the end of the war in Friuli. So we have dozens of examples, but what is interesting apart from numbers and the specific story, is that they're really useful in understanding how what they told us about the resistance after the war. It was not all of it. It was not national. It was another kind of struggle, and that everyone could have seen, could have been part in it, because fighting fascism was a fight for, human life and dignity.
One great article on the international nature of the Italian resistance is called Migrant Partisans, the Internationalist Resistance Against Italian Fascism by the Wu Ming Foundation. It includes more info about the groups Davide mentions, not to mention many others, like the Lions of Breda Solini, a battalion of Sinti partisans who had escaped a concentration camp and joined the resistance. We'll include a link to that article in the show notes. In part 1, we spoke about the anti-fascist resistance in the mountains, but the cities, as hubs of both economic and political power, were also important sites of action for the resistance. One key form of urban resistance activity was the strike. In the last episode, we spoke about the March 1943 strikes which rocked Mussolini's regime. But from September 1943, striking workers didn't just have Mussolini's fascists to worry about, but also the occupying Nazi army. About 8,000 striking workers would be deported from Italy to Mauthausen concentration camp, many of whom never returned. Yet despite this, strikes continued throughout the Nazi occupation. In November 1943, a wildcat strike broke out in Turin in response to workers being killed after management refused to suspend work when an air raid siren went off. The strike spread around the city, then on December 1st to Milan, where Nazi authorities began arresting striking workers before being forced to release them. After Milan, the movement spread to Genoa, the third city in Italy's industrial triangle. Workers marched out of their factories and were joined by the wider population. When authorities shot 3 demonstrators, the resistance declared public mourning, with everything shutting down, especially in working class parts of the city. Then, in March 1944, while occupied by one of human history's most violent regimes, workers staged a series of coordinated general strikes across northern Italy, in what was one of the biggest in occupied Europe. One estimate put the number of strikers at 1.2 million. An article in the New York Times claimed between 3 and 6 million. Sabotage of rail and electricity lines were timed to coincide with walkouts, while a printers' strike stopped the country's main newspaper, Corriere della Sera, from appearing for 3 days. The New York Times wrote about the March 1944 strikes that, quote, "Nothing has occurred in occupied Europe to compare in scale with the revolt of the workers in Italy. It is the climax of a campaign of sabotage, local strikes, and guerrilla warfare. It is an impressive proof that the Italians, unarmed as they are and under double bondage, will fight with reckless courage when they have something to fight for." End quote. Strikes had become an integral part of the anti-fascist resistance, not least in the partisan insurrections that finally liberated the big northern cities, which we'll discuss later. For many, anti-fascism and class struggle were intimately linked, in no small part because the big Italian employers had been among the strongest supporters of fascism. However, employers soon saw the writing on the wall and began to prepare for life after fascism by looking for elements of the resistance that they could work with, something which we'll discuss in more detail in part 3. Resistance in the city also took the form of urban guerrilla actions. In late 1943, the Communist Party set up the Patriotic Action Groups, also known as GAPs. GAP members, or Gapisti as they were known, did things like targeted assassinations, sabotage of infrastructure, and guerrilla attacks on soldiers and the police. Life as a Gapista was tough. Multiple Gapisti described it as even harder than the resistance in the mountains. They recount the extreme loneliness of a life permanently in hiding, the tension following an action, and the constant feeling of being hunted like an animal. In contrast to the resistance in the mountains where membership was looser, Gapisti was selected from within party structures, not just on the basis of political or military reliability, but also what historian and former partisan Claudio Pavone describes as a, quote, coldness and determination of character, end quote. Alfredo Schiavi, who we spoke to in part 1, was one such Gapista.
I was transferred, together with Erasmo, my other Latin-speaking friend, in another town in Piemonte, which I cannot tell you, to become a Gapista. Those were partisan groups who were quite restricted. The Gapisti, which worked in small groups of 2 or 3 partisans inside the cities as spies or to kill enemy informants and spies. We lived at a priest's house where I was disguised as an altar boy with a thurible, chained incense burner, which you can find in any church. The priest was dressed in purple, which meant he was responsible in giving the last rites to soldiers, so we could go pretty much everywhere without problems. We didn't know anything about anyone. We knew only the notes we received. This needs to be done, that needs to be done, etc. One time we were moved. We had to go to Milan. This I will tell you. We had to eliminate a captain of the Black Brigade, a fascist paramilitary group, an evil man. He lived near Corso Buenos Aires. Every morning at 8:30, he came down and there was a car that was waiting for him. And we, for 2 or 3 days, went there, and this car with 2 or 3 people were escorting him naturally. We didn't go into homes. We needed to do everything in the open. One morning, it was raining. We were there as usual. Obviously, I wasn't dressed like an altar boy anymore. And there, we saw him at the door, and the car wasn't waiting there. So what did he do? He walked a bit to take the tram, and he paid for it dearly.
Another city which saw fierce partisan resistance was Rome. On 23rd of March 1944, the infamous Via Rasella attack took place. Roman partisans attacked 156 fully armed Nazi soldiers marching behind a motorbike with a mounted machine gun in the sidecar. 10 kilos of dynamite were exploded, and while the Nazis were still reeling, a group of partisans attacked them with hand grenades and machine guns. 33 Nazis were killed and over 100 wounded. The action was a success, but as Roman partisan Mario Fiorentini explains, they could not have been prepared for what would happen next.
From my balcony, on the facade of the building in front, all the way to the highest floor, they can be easily recognize the signs of the bombs that exploded on 23rd March 1944 in Via Rasella. Back then, I already lived in this house. In the area, I was known, and it was for this reason that our commander, Carlo Salinari, forced me not to participate in the action that I had the idea and prepared the details for, because I was seeing the Nazis of the Bosen Battalion March pass every day at the same time. 33 soldiers and 2 passers-by died as a result of the blast. But the next day, 24th March 1944, there was an escalation in the speed of the reprisals that we, of the GAP, were not able to predict. The killing of 335 hostages in the Ardeatine massacre. Fate wanted me to live for more than a century to shed my tears again, as I am doing now, in front of those innocent martyrs. I claim the hard necessity of actions like that of Via Rasella, because the enemy needed to be fought in the cities, not just in the mountains, but the ferocious immediacy with which it was exercised, not even 24 hours after. We could not have predicted the Nazi reaction because it was without precedent.
As we mentioned in part 1, reprisals worked along a rule of murdering 10 people for every Nazi or fascist killed. With 33 soldiers killed, that meant 330 were supposed to be transported to the Ardeatine caves to be murdered in revenge. Partisans were led into the caves in groups of 5. Their hands tied behind their backs, they were then shot in the neck. Many were forced to kneel over the dead who had been killed before them as the cave became filled with bodies. During the massacre, it was noticed that an extra group of 5 had been brought by mistake, but they were also killed anyway, bringing the total killed to 335. As another example of what's wrong with viewing the resistance through the lens of a national war, and the often cynical motivations of those who do, in March 2023, Italy's far-right Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni put out a statement supposedly to commemorate the anniversary of the Ardeatine massacre. In it, she described the victims as having been killed just for being Italian. What Meloni leaves out here is not just that those killed were actually anti-fascists, but that their killing was only possible because of the collaboration of Italians whose political lineage would extend to include Meloni herself. One of those killed in the Ardeatine massacre was particularly important to Mario.
Francesca Manacorda ha dato la risposta più bella.
Among the innocent victims of the Ardeatine massacre, fate wanted that he would be included Fernando Norma of the Justice and Freedom Brigade, who was my teacher in anti-fascism, together with Paolo Emilio Manacorda. They were the ones who opened my eyes, instilled political passions in a young man like myself, who for economic reasons had not had the possibilities to pursue education. My father, Pacifico Fiorentini, was Jewish. When Mussolini announced the racial laws in 1938, I was 20. In reaction, I went to the head rabbi in Rome and asked him to convert me, but he dissuaded me. The sad day of the ghetto raid, 16th October 1943. My parents were also captured, and only at the last moment were they able to bribe someone from the SS and escape, while I got away by jumping over the rooftops.
Historical revisionists often claim that the anti-Semitic atrocities which took place in Italy were the fault of German Nazis rather than Italian fascists. And though anti-Semitism was fringe in early Italian fascism, it became a major theme after the invasion of Ethiopia, with regime propaganda promoting the racial superiority of so-called pure Italians over Africans. Anti-Semitic themes increased in the Italian press, culminating in the 1938 racial laws and the Manifesto of the Race which accompanied them, stating that Italians must, quote, openly declare themselves racist, end quote, and that Jews, quote, do not belong to the Italian race, end quote. The racial laws made it illegal for Jews to study or teach in schools or universities, or work in banks, insurance companies, or the government. Jews could not publish books or own land over a certain value. They could not marry non-Jews, and those naturalized since 1919 lost their citizenship. When Rome's Jewish ghetto was raided, over 1,000 Jews were rounded up and deported to concentration camps. On arrival, they were separated into 2 groups. The first, consisting of over 200 people, were sent to do forced labour. The second group, consisting of 820 people, were judged incapable of forced labour and sent directly to the gas chambers. Out of over 1,000 Jews rounded up in the ghetto raid, only 16 survived. In total, 2,091 Jews were deported from Rome, 1,067 men, 743 women, and 281 children. Just over 100 survived. All of the 281 children deported from Rome were killed in the camps. Mario Fiorentini and his parents escaped an almost certain death, and for Mario it meant his continued involvement in the Roman Gap.
Allora lui mi ha detto, senti, a Regina Coeli...
In our action unit, there were intellectuals who had transformed themselves into fearless soldiers. It had actually been one of them, Antonello Trombadori, who told us that we had to react with an unbelievably big action to the arrest of Sandro Pertini and Giuseppe Saragat, 2 high-ranking socialist politicians involved in the resistance who were locked up in Rome's Regina Coeli's prison. So, On 26th December 1943, while my comrades covered my back, I got on my bicycle and at the time of the changing of the guard, threw myself on the Lungotevere parallel to Via della Lungara. I threw a package with 2 kilos of TNT at the SS men guarding the prison gate. 8 died, 5 instantly. Ready to throw myself into the river when the first volleys fired from the windows of Regina Coeli, I started pedaling desperately amidst the bullets. I was lucky. They didn't have time to hit me.
With continued strikes and guerrilla actions in both city and countryside, and the continued Allied push from the south, it was only a matter of time until fascism was defeated. The consensus was that the resistance needed to topple fascism itself. For some, this was to prove the democratic and anti-fascist credentials of the Italian people. For others, particularly rank-and-file communists, it was to be the first step of the working class to transform society. It should be said, however, that this opinion was not necessarily shared by the leadership of their party, as we'll discuss in parts 3 and 4. Whatever the motivations, it was generally agreed that to topple fascism, it would take a series of insurrections in Italy's major northern cities. But by the end of 1944, only Naples and Florence had been liberated via insurrection, and even in Florence it took 3 weeks and the arrival of Allied soldiers. All this changed by the spring of 1945, with a string of partisan insurrections liberating one city after another. First was Bologna, where on April 20th, with the Nazis fleeing the city, partisans occupied the city's main buildings. Fighting was relatively brief, but resulted in 300 Nazis dead and 1,000 captured. The Allies, pushing north through the countryside as part of their spring offensive, arrived the next day into an already liberated city. 2 days after the liberation of Bologna, rail workers in Milan declared an indefinite strike. The next day, GAP members attacked fascist barracks in broad daylight. An insurrection was called for April 25th at 2 p.m, and by that evening the city's main public buildings, radio station, newspaper and military offices were occupied by partisans. Give or take a few fascist holdouts, Milan was under full partisan control by April 27th, with the Allies arriving in the city 2 days later. The same day that rail workers in Milan walked out, a general strike was called in the major port city of Genoa. The Nazis offered to leave the city untouched if they were allowed to withdraw peacefully, but as one partisan commander put it, quote, "Do you really think we've gone through so many months of war, enduring so many sacrifices and deaths, just to let you escape unharmed?" End quote. That night, partisans attacked positions throughout Genoa, occupied the police headquarters and released political prisoners from the city's main jail. By the evening of April 25th, Remo Scappini, a communist partisan from a working-class family near Florence who had started working when he was just 10 years old, found himself negotiating the total surrender of General Gunther Meinhold and 30,000 Nazi soldiers. Allied troops arrived on April 27th to find the liberated Genoa being run by partisans. Turin probably suffered the most difficult path to liberation. On the night of the 18th to the 19th of April, while unrest was still building in Bologna, a general strike began in Turin with the slogans "Against Hunger and Terror," "Milk for Children," and "Fascists, Surrender or Die." A week later, on the 26th of April, an insurrection began with partisans from the countryside descending on the city. By the morning of April 28th, Turin had been liberated. The Allies arrived on May 2nd to find yet another major city already under democratic control. While partisan insurrections were causing fascism to collapse in city after city, Mussolini left his wife and children behind and, dressed as a German soldier, attempted to sneak into Switzerland with his mistress. Unfortunately for him, he was spotted by a partisan who called out, "We've got Big Head." He was arrested by members of Alfredo's 52nd Garibaldi Brigade and then executed. One of those who carried out the execution was Aldo Lampredi, a veteran of the Spanish Civil War who had spent years in fascist jails. Before Mussolini was shot, Lampredi said to him, quote, "Who would have said that the communists, who you persecuted for so long, would settle their accounts with you?" End quote. Mussolini's body was then hung in Piazzale Loreto, a square in Milan where the bodies of 15 massacred partisans had been left on public display less than a year earlier. Alfredo, who was acting as a gapista somewhere in Piedmont, told us about his memories of liberation.
Siamo stati lì fino io a lui,
fino al...
In the end, we remained there until the 25th of April, me and Erasmo, when the priest told us the password from Radio London, 26 per 1, 26 for 1. That meant we were supposed to get down from the mountains and get out from the factories to arrest the fascists while ignoring the Germans. The resistance was over. We went out with our civilian clothes. I was 18, Erasmo was between 20 and 23, and we had to go back to Alessandria, which was an important hotspot for Italian railways. Trains came from Genoa, Milan, Turin. There were lots of German troops there for this reason, especially the division who surrendered in Genoa the day before. With their vehicles, they were moving from Genoa to Alessandria, where they were supposed to take trains to Germany. They were free to move, while fascists had to be captured and taken to a big camp near Livorno, where they would have been questioned, held as prisoners, or moved to Rome. We arrived there on the bank of a river, I don't remember the name. Then we spotted some black shirts standing on the other side, so we thought they were moving towards Alessandria. We were quite afraid that they could do something stupid, so we waited. But they did nothing, so we decided to move. We got up with our rifles. I shot some rounds with my Sten, the others threw some bombs. So we managed to cross the river, and in the end they were trees that had been chopped down, and we thought they were fascists waiting for us. Then a peasant with a wagon gave us a ride to Alessandria. I remember he had some wooden stakes, and we hung a red cloth from them like a flag. When we were on the main road, we crossed the German division, and we just waved and said hi to them. Afterwards, I stopped at Rivalta Scrivia, where my uncle lived. Luckily, I stayed there with him for a week. Then my father came with a bicycle, and we rode back around 60 kilometers to Pavia. It was the beginning of May.
But despite the Nazi occupation being in a state of collapse and its army in retreat, it still carried a significant threat to the locals it came across. Elsa, who was now still only 16, experienced the seriousness of that threat firsthand.
Sono stata presa 7 ore.
I was taken hostage for 7 hours by the SS when a caravan ready to escape back to Germany stopped in our village. We couldn't fight it, we didn't have weapons like they did, because it was an 80-vehicle caravan. The GLN said that we should send someone to negotiate, that if they surrender they would be allowed to pass freely to the Brenner Pass, which goes from Italy into Austria. But our commander Nico said that if a man went, then they'd kill him immediately. So what should we do? I said that I'd go, as I knew a few words of German. They sent me with a bag filled with bread, and they told me, "You need to say we forced you to do this." And so I went to negotiate. There was a commander of the Wehrmacht. He accepted and said, "For us it's fine, but there in the hotel is the commander of the SS, and we need his authorization." And he took me there to talk with the SS commander. When the SS commander heard what I had to say, he took a rifle and said, "To partisans we respond like this," and then fired right next to me. My brother and the others in the hills thought that they killed me, because after 7 hours I hadn't gone back. They locked me in a room. I won't go into particulars. I don't even want to let anyone know about what happened then. But it was 7 hours of hell. 7 hours that I spent in terrible fear. And I prayed. I prayed the rebels' prayers of Catholic partisan Teresio Olivelli. In torture, clamp our lips, break us in half, don't let us spend. Because they continue to ask me questions, and I was saying, they forced me as I was coming out to the shop with my bread, and they forced me to take this mission. As such, I don't know anything. I know the valley is full of partisans, but I don't know where they are. I continue like this, and I continue with this long process. And you can imagine after 7 hours, I was really scared. They opened the door, and I could see at that point that there were only 2 vans. The one in front, they were loaded with machine guns, and they made me get into the last one. And I remember this scene forever because I saw this man at the steering wheel. He had the hair swept back, like my dad. That was true. And I looked at him and I told him, because I knew a few words of German, because we studied German at school back then, I told him that he looked like my dad because he had hair like him. Before he wasn't looking at me, but after that he turned and looked at me and asked, "How old are you?" I was 16. I just had my birthday on April the 4th, so this was the 22nd, so I was 16. And then he said, "You're the same age as my daughter that I haven't seen for 3 years." Because of this, I started to look at him a bit differently. Before, inside me, I had bitterness towards the SS for what they had done to me. But I looked at him and he looked at me almost with compassion. After they finished loading the other truck, we'd only exchanged a couple of words because I didn't know any more German to make myself understood. And when the truck in front went around the bend towards Cunetone, the rest of the caravan had gone, he opened the door for me and said, "Raus, raus, out, out." He stroked my face and then he let me out. I ran so fast from Tormini to Ro, I broke Pietro Mennea's world record. When I arrived back to the hills, my brother and the others welcomed me with joy. This was on the 22nd. On April 29th, we had the celebration of the 25th of April, the liberation. The church bells had rang and etc. Don Angelo was giving a Thanksgiving Mass because we were all alive. The war was finished. We were okay. The Mass finished. It was about 9:30 and we could hear tank trucks that were passing by our town of Roe. "Huh?" said Don Angelo. "It's impossible. They could be the Americans already. They were just in Parma. They couldn't possibly be here already." And so we ran down to the end of the street where the main road passed. And then we saw passing tanks with swastikas on them. My God, the Germans are still around. This was the 29th of April, 4 days after liberation. Thinking that the valley was filled with partisans that were firing at random. In this way, they killed my auntie, who had opened the door to call her daughter, who was in the bathroom behind the house, and she was hit by the machine gun fire. Because anything that moved, they shot and killed.
But despite the continued threat of the retreating Nazi army, Elsa still had fond memories of liberation.
Quel giorno è stato un giorno meraviglioso.
Oh, that day was marvellous because we heard the bells ring, the factory sirens going off, and then above all for us, we could finally say that we were partisan. We could tell people that we were partisan. It was such a liberation because until then nobody could say who they were and what they did. They couldn't. It was truly a joy and we thought that everything would be different. We partisans rolled up our sleeves and worked to rebuild the houses, to redo everything because it had all been bombed. We were all poor and we had to work, and we worked. My hope while I was part of the struggle for liberation were to live in freedom and finally to be able to enjoy the famous freedom that Don Angelo taught us, how other people lived. We thought that we could live freely and without impositions, a thing which unfortunately for political reasons did not happen.
Appena alzata, oh bella ciao, bella ciao, bella ciao, ciao, ciao alla mattina.
That's all we've got time for in this episode. Join us in part 3 where we'll discuss what happened to the fascist movement and anti-fascist resistance in the years after the war, including betrayals, injustices and divisions between partisans. Meanwhile, in part 4, we look at how former partisans took justice into their own hands, talk about some armed uprisings, and how the resistance is thought about today. That's all available now for our supporters on Patreon. We also have 3 bonus episodes for this series. In the first, we discuss some of our favourite Italian films about fascism and the resistance. In our second bonus episode, we talk about some of the music that came out of the Italian resistance. And in our final bonus episode, we talk more with Davide about post-war anti-fascism and the continuity of Italian fascism from the war to today's government. All of this available exclusively for our supporters on Patreon. It is only support from you, our listeners, which allows us to keep making these podcasts. So if you appreciate our work, please do think about joining us at patreon.com/workingclasshistory, link in the show notes. In return for your support, you get early access to episodes, ad-free episodes, as well as exclusive bonus content, discounted merch and more. And if you can't spare the cash, absolutely no problem. Please just tell your friends about this podcast and give us a 5-star review on your favourite podcast app. If you'd like to learn more about the Italian resistance to fascism, check out the webpage for this episode where you'll find images, a full list of sources, further reading and more. Link in the show notes. We also really want to thank Carlo Giannuzzi from the Commissione Scuola Anpi Brescia and Davide from Cronaca Ribelli for all their invaluable help producing this series. We'd also like to thank the National Association of Italian Partisans for letting us use interviews from their amazing Noi Partigiani website, which contains over 650 interviews with participants in the Italian resistance. Link to all of these in the show notes. We'd also like to thank Lillian McCarthy and Davide for their translations, and to our amazing voice actors, Susie, Carlo Giannuzzi, Chiara, Carlo, Giacomo Palloni, and Anpi Londra. Thanks also to our Patreon supporters for making this podcast possible, and special thanks to Jameson D. Saltzman, Jazz Hands, and Fernando Lopez Ojeda. Our theme tune is Bella Ciao. Thanks for permission to use it from Dischi del Sole. You can buy it or stream it on the links in the show notes. This episode was edited by Tyler Hill. Anyway, that's it for today. Hope you enjoyed the episode and thanks for listening.
Oh, bella ciao.